I collapsed in the middle of a board meeting in Chicago. Not gradually, not dramatically. One moment I was standing at the head of a 12-foot walnut table outlining a leveraged restructuring strategy that would save the company 8 figures in annual burn. The next, the numbers on the screen dissolved into white haze. I remember tightening my grip on the laser pointer. Then my hand stopped responding. The room tilted. Someone said my name. I don't remember falling. I remember the silence just before impact. The kind of silence that only happens when powerful men realize something is outside their control. When I regained partial awareness, I was on the floor. Faces above me. Expensive suits leaning inward. Someone saying, "Call 911. Another voice, distant. He's not responding. My heart rhythm had destabilized. Blood pressure crashed. The paramedics later told me I was seconds from full cardiac arrest. They loaded me onto a stretcher. Oxygen mask. Cold adhesive pads pressed against my chest. One of them kept saying, "Stay with me, sir. Sir, I've built companies from nothing. I've negotiated hostile acquisitions that reshaped markets. I've buried competitors with spreadsheets and patience. And in that elevator, I was reduced to a failing pulse. They called my wife, Laura. I wasn't fully conscious, but I heard enough. We're airlifting him to Northwestern Memorial. You're scheduled to fly out tonight, correct?" The medic asked. A pause. "We can delay the flight if necessary." Another pause. Then the medic's tone changed. More direct. "Ma'am, I need to be clear. He might not survive." The rotor blades outside were already building to a scream, but her voice cut through clearly. "I can't cancel. It's a critical investment trip. Just keep me informed." Critical investment trip. Tuscany. With Mark, her investment partner. The helicopter lifted. The city fell away beneath me in cold geometry. Steel, glass, concrete. Everything I had built my life mastering. And I wondered, in a strangely detached way, whether Laura had already calculated the outcome. If I died, she inherited control. If I survived but weakened, she gained leverage. If I was incapacitated, even briefly, power shifted. I lost consciousness before we landed. I woke up 26 hours later in intensive care. Machines hummed with indifferent precision. For lines fed clear fluids into my veins. My chest ached with the memory of defibrillation. Every breath felt measured. A cardiologist stood at my bedside. Calm. Professional. "You were close," he said. "Severe arrhythmia triggered by extreme stress and unmanaged hypertension. We stabilized you, but understand something clearly: you cannot continue at this pace. Your body will not tolerate it again." His words were clinical, final. "Was there neurological damage?" I asked. He blinked, slightly surprised at the question. "No. Cognitively, you're intact." That mattered more than survival. When the nurse stepped out, I requested my phone. It had been sealed in a plastic belongings bag. I opened it slowly, ignoring the protest in my chest. I keep transaction alerts active on every account I control. It's not paranoia, it's governance. The first notification was timestamped 3:12 a.m. Urgent transfer, $180,000. Joint investment account. Then another. Portfolio reallocation, $420,000. Strategic holdings. Another. Asset migration, $315,000. International holding. The timestamps were clustered between 2:40 and 5:10 a.m. while I was unconscious, while doctors were debating whether my heart would stabilize. Over $1. $3 million had been moved, authorized, by Laura, under power of attorney. I felt no spike of anger, no surge of adrenaline, only a cooling sensation, like stepping into winter air after leaving a heated room. Years ago, on advice from counsel, I structured limited emergency authority for Laura, narrow in scope, activated only upon documented medical incapacity certified by attending physicians. Had that certification been issued? I pressed the call button. When the nurse returned, I asked, "Has any document been issued declaring me legally incapacitated?" She looked confused. "No, sir. You were sedated, but there was no incapacity ruling. That was enough, which meant Laura had acted preemptively or creatively. I began making calls. First, my CFO. Do not react, I told him. Implement standard executive health contingency protocol. Restrict non-essential credential access across financial and corporate systems. Quietly. He didn't ask questions. That's why he's been with me 17 years. Second, my private banker. I need a temporary outbound freeze on transfers exceeding $50,000. Internal review trigger only. No external notifications. He hesitated, then complied. Third, my estate attorney. I want a complete registry search of any documents filed in my name or by proxy in the past 72 hours. Silence on the other end. You suspect something? He asked. I verify, I replied. By late afternoon, preliminary findings arrived. The transfers were structured. Funds routed through layered entities, 2 domestic LLCs unfamiliar to me. 1 offshore holding vehicle registered in Lisbon, Portugal. Laura's Tuscany trip was not about vineyards. It was about execution. I lay back against the pillow, for fluid dripping steadily, heart monitor ticking like a metronome. She had moved during the narrowest window possible, when I was medically compromised, unreachable, presumed unstable. She had not stayed. She had not waited. She had acted. And that told me something important. This wasn't emotional. It was strategic, which meant it had been planned long before my collapse. I replayed recent months in my mind. Her insistence that I slow down. Her comments about legacy protection. Her increasingly frequent meetings with Mark. The subtle suggestion that I considered delegating operational control. At the time, I interpreted it as concern. Now I saw architecture. If she could establish medical fragility, even temporarily, she could petition for extended authority. If assets were repositioned in advance, she could control liquidity before I stabilized. If corporate leadership perceived weakness, board dynamics could shift. From a hospital bed, I saw the outline clearly. This was not a spontaneous reaction to a medical scare. It was acceleration. She had mistaken silence for decline. She had mistaken restraint for weakness. The cardiologist returned that evening and repeated his warning about stress. He was right. Stress nearly K** led me. But betrayal? Betrayal clarified me. My pulse slowed. My breathing evened. If Laura believed I was diminished, confused, recovering, uncertain, that assumption would work in my favor. Let her think the event rattled me. Let her believe the transfers went unnoticed. Let Mark toast to transition over Tuscan wine. I closed my eyes. Not in exhaustion. In calculation. Because if my wife had already begged asterisk and repositioning assets while I hovered between life and death, then this was no longer about recovery. It was about containment. And I was still alive. Laura returned from Tuscany 4 days after I was moved out of intensive care. She entered my hospital room carrying white lilies. Controlled smile. Composed posture. Sunglasses still perched in her hair, as if she had stepped directly off a terrace overlooking vineyards instead of off an international flight timed during my medical emergency. You look better, she said, setting the flowers down. I feel stable, I replied. Not stronger. Not grateful. Stable. She kissed my forehead lightly. A gesture practiced enough to appear concerned, distant enough to avoid an asterisk Macy. Mark sends his regards, she added casually. The meetings were productive. Of course they were. I watched her carefully. No tremor in her hands. No hesitation in eye contact. If she felt guilt, it was deeply compartmentalized. How's the board reacting? She asked. Concerned, I said. They've been advised to expect temporary delegation. Her eyes sharpened for half a second. Temporary delegation. She nodded slowly. That's wise. You need rest. There it was again. Reinforcement of fragility. I said nothing, because by the time she landed at O'Hare, I had already hired 2 men. The first was a forensic financial auditor, discreet, methodical, former partner at a global firm that specialized in asset tracing and offshore recovery. He arrived at my office the morning after I was discharged. The second was a retired federal investigator named Daniel Ruiz. 28 years in white-collar crime. Calm voice, surgical mind. He did not speak unnecessarily. I briefed them in my private conference room. No law enforcement, I said. Not yet. I want documentation. Full tracing. Every entity. Every transfer. Timeline reconstruction. They worked without drama. Within a week, the structure was mapped. Laura and Mark had created a Portuguese holding company 6 months prior. Ownership layered through 2 shell entities registered in Delaware. The capital injections from my accounts were not spontaneous emergency reallocations. They were final-stage funding transfers. The groundwork had been laid long before my collapse. Even more concerning, Ruiz uncovered internal emails between Laura and Mark referencing a capacity review. They had consulted a private physician in New York about obtaining a second medical opinion regarding cognitive stress deterioration. In plain language, they were preparing to argue that my executive judgment was impaired. My hospitalization was an opportunity, not a trigger. The plan was elegant. Establish financial repositioning offshore. Question executive competency post-cardiac event. Petition for expanded power of attorney citing health risk. Influence the board to initiate leadership transition. Liquidate controlling shares quietly. Exit. I felt no shock reading the summary. Only confirmation. Meanwhile, Laura increased her visibility within the company. She attended 2 executive meetings in my absence. Requested operational briefings. Asked pointed questions about succession planning. Mark appeared once at headquarters under the pretense of reviewing international capital partnerships. My CFO documented everything. Board members began receiving subtle suggestions that continuity planning should accelerate in light of my health. One director called me privately. "Are you stepping back permanently?" he asked carefully. "No," I said. "I am evaluating internal resilience." That answer traveled fast. Laura noticed the shift immediately. The following evening, she visited my study at home. I had resumed working limited hours. "You're pushing too hard," she said. "The board is worried." "About what?" "Your stability, the stress, the optics." "Optics," I repeated. She stepped closer. "You nearly died. I survived." She held my gaze. "That doesn't mean you're invincible." "I've never been invincible," I said calmly. "Only prepared." Something flickered behind her expression. Concern? No. Assessment. 2 days later, Ruiz brought in the most significant piece of evidence yet. Mark had been involved in a prior investigation in Atlanta 5 years earlier. A similar pattern. Leveraged medical vulnerability of an aging founder, facilitated offshore asset repositioning, exited before litigation surfaced. The case had settled privately. Laura knew this. Email archives confirmed her awareness of Mark's history before entering business partnership with him. This was not manipulation from Mark alone. It was collaboration. At this point, the financial transfers had reached $2.4 million. The board had not yet acted, but Laura was building narrative momentum. Then she made her move. Through her attorney, she requested formal medical evaluation documentation from Northwestern, citing concerns regarding executive fitness. Simultaneously, she attempted to activate expanded financial authority under the existing POA, arguing that my cardiac episode constituted ongoing vulnerability. My attorney denied the expansion request immediately, but the attempt itself was enough. She was accelerating, so I accelerated faster. I convened a private board session without Laura present. Every director received a confidential memorandum summarizing my health status, signed by 2 cardiologists affirming full cognitive capacity. Then Ruiz presented a controlled briefing. Offshore transfers, shell entities, premeditated structuring. No accusations, only documentation. Silence filled the room when he finished. One of the directors, a man who had known me 30 years, leaned back slowly. "Does Laura know you're aware?" he asked. "No," I said. "And Mark?" "No." He nodded once. Then we move carefully. Within 48 hours, corporate access credentials assigned to Laura were suspended pending internal compliance review. Banking institutions were formally notified of active investigation into unauthorized structured transfers. The Portuguese holding company accounts were flagged under international anti-money laundering protocols. Not criminal accusation, simply review. That was enough to freeze liquidity. Laura and Mark landed back in Chicago from a second European trip 2 days later. They were expecting progression. Instead, they found containment. When Laura attempted to log into the executive financial dashboard, access was denied. When Mark contacted the Lisbon intermediary bank, he was informed the account was under compliance hold. When they arrived at headquarters, federal agents were not present. But 2 compliance officers and external counsel were. The board had unanimously voted to revoke Laura's corporate authority pending investigation. Mark attempted composure. He smiled in the lobby as if this were procedural. But I watched him from my office balcony above. His jaw tightened. His shoulders lost alignment. He understood. They had believed I was weakened. Instead, they had triggered exposure. That evening, Laura came home later than usual. She entered the house without turning on lights. I was in the study. She stood in the doorway for several seconds before speaking. "What did you do?" she asked quietly. "I reviewed," I replied. Her voice remained controlled. "You've overreacted." "No," I said. "I responded proportionally." She stepped inside. "Mark says the freezes are temporary." "Mark is mistaken." She studied me in silence. For the first time in years, there was no calculation in her eyes. Only uncertainty. "You're going to destroy everything," she said finally. I folded my hands on the desk. "No," I answered. "I'm going to protect it." And in that moment, I saw something shift. Not fear of legal consequences. Fear of losing control. She had prepared for my death. She had prepared for my decline. She had not prepared for my clarity. Laura retained counsel within 48 hours of the corporate access suspension. Mark did the same. Their strategy was predictable. Deny intent. Frame the transfers as protective diversification. Argue spousal authority under implied trust. Question my emotional stability post-cardiac trauma. They filed a petition requesting an independent neurological assessment, implying possible executive impairment following acute cardiac event. It was subtle, carefully worded. If granted, it would open the door to formal competency review. They weren't just protecting money. They were trying to institutionalize me. I did not react publicly. Instead, I widened the perimeter. Ruiz expanded the financial timeline to 18 months. Every email between Laura and Mark was preserved through corporate server archives. Deleted messages recovered. Metadata reconstructed. Patterns emerged. They had discussed my burn rate months before my collapse. They speculated about transition windows. One message from Mark read, "If something medical happens, we accelerate. The board will panic. That's our leverage point." Laura's reply was worse. "He won't see it coming. He trusts me." I read that line twice, not because it hurt, because it clarified motive. Meanwhile, the Portuguese holding structure unraveled under compliance scrutiny. The Lisbon intermediary froze secondary transfers. One of the Delaware shell entities had been registered using an address tied to a dissolved accounting firm previously cited for regulatory violations. Mark had been sloppy, or arrogant, possibly both. The board scheduled a formal internal inquiry hearing. Not public, not yet, but recorded, transcribed, binding. Laura attended with counsel. She wore gray, conservative, controlled. Mark arrived separately. I entered last. No theatrics, no raised voice. The general counsel began. "Mrs. Hale, Mr. Thornton, this inquiry concerns structured asset transfers totaling $2.4 million, potential misuse of limited power of attorney authority, and documented communications suggesting premeditated financial repositioning tied to executive health speculation." Laura's attorney objected to phrasing. Denied. Ruiz presented first. Clear slides. Chronological mapping. shell entity formation dates, transfer timestamps aligning precisely with my hospitalization window. Then the emails, displayed without commentary. Mark's language about acceleration. Laura's response about trust. Silence thickened in the room. Mark attempted composure. These were theoretical discussions, he said. Contingency planning. Any responsible investor prepares for leadership disruption. Leadership disruption, I repeated evenly. Not death. He didn't answer. Laura spoke next. Her voice remained calm. I acted to protect marital assets. My husband has a history of overexposure in volatile markets. I diversified holdings. You routed them offshore, I said. For tax efficiency. Through entities you concealed. She hesitated. That hesitation was enough. The board vote was unanimous. Laura was formally removed from any advisory or corporate involvement pending civil review. Mark's access to corporate facilities was permanently revoked. But the internal inquiry was only the first layer. Because simultaneously, federal authorities had N reviewing the offshore transfers under anti-money laundering statutes once compliance flags were triggered. Not because I called them, because Mark's structure touched previously flagged intermediaries. He had repeated an old pattern, and patterns leave trails. The civil proceedings began 3 weeks later. Laura attempted reconciliation before filing. She came to my office one evening without notice. No criminal charges, she said quietly. We can settle privately. You already attempted to settle privately, I replied. In Lisbon. Her jaw tightened. You're going to ruin both of us. No, I said calmly. You already attempted that. The divorce filing included claims of marital asset protection. My countersuit included fraud, misuse of fiduciary authority, and attempted unlawful seizure of corporate control. Discovery was brutal. For her, bank records, travel itineraries, private physician consultations discussing competency positioning. Mark's prior Atlanta settlement surfaced through subpoena. The judge reviewed the documentation without visible reaction. But his rulings were decisive. All transferred funds were ordered returned under court supervision. Mark was referred for criminal investigation tied to financial structuring and prior undisclosed settlements. Laura faced civil penalties for fraudulent exercise of power of attorney and attempted coercive competency filing. In court, the moment that ended it came unexpectedly. Laura's attorney attempted to argue that my cardiac event demonstrated diminished judgment leading up to hospitalization. Patricia, my counsel, requested permission to enter into record my full medical evaluation timeline. 2 cardiologists testified under oath. No neurological impairment, no cognitive deficit, no executive dysfunction. Then Ruiz was called. He read Laura's email aloud. He won't see it coming. He trusts me. The courtroom was silent. Laura did not look at me. Mark did. For the first time, he looked uncertain. When the verdict was delivered months later, it was clinical. Mark received a federal indictment related to structured financial fraud and prior concealed misconduct. Eventually, he accepted a plea agreement carrying custodial sentencing. Laura received a suspended sentence, significant financial penalties, and a permanent prohibition from holding executive fiduciary roles. Her professional reputation dissolved quietly. No headlines, just industry silence. In the hallway outside the courtroom, she finally looked at me directly. There was no arrogance left. No calculation. Only emptiness. You could have stopped this, she said. I considered that carefully. Yes, I replied, before you began. And I walked past her. The devastating part wasn't the sentencing. It wasn't the frozen accounts or revoked credentials. It was exposure. Their strategy had relied on invisibility, on the assumption that I would panic or collapse emotionally. Instead, every document surfaced, every layer traced, every assumption reversed. They had prepared for my death. They had prepared for my weakness. They had not prepared for my patience. My recovery was slower than I expected. Not physically. Physically, the cardiologist cleared me within 3 months. My numbers stabilized. My blood pressure normalized under adjusted medication. I walked every morning along the lake path near our home. 5 miles, measured, deliberate. What required recalibration was structure. Betrayal is not loud once it ends. It becomes administrative. The divorce finalized without spectacle. Laura signed the settlement agreement in silence. She did not contest the financial restitution terms. She did not attempt appeal. There was nothing left to leverage. I restructured immediately. First, I dissolved all joint asset exposure. Every personal holding moved into a protective, irrevocable trust under independent fiduciary oversight. Authority layered, audited, documented. Second, I amended corporate governance protocols. No single spousal or familial authority would ever again hold emergency activation privileges without dual independent medical certification. Third, I revised succession planning, not because I intended to step down, but because clarity prevents opportunism. The board supported every measure unanimously. Investors responded with quiet confidence. Markets are unemotional. They reward stability. Laura vacated the house 2 weeks after the final ruling. She took only what was allocated under settlement, nothing more. I watched from my study window as the moving truck closed its doors. No confrontation, no final argument, just the end of a miscalculation. Mark's sentencing occurred quietly months later. Federal custody, reduced term under plea agreement. His firm dissolved, licenses revoked. Patterns eventually catch up to those who repeat them. The most powerful moment, however, was not the court's verdict. It was the first board meeting after everything concluded. Same walnut table, same chairs, but Laura's seat was empty. I entered without announcement. The room stood instinctively. I did not reference the scandal. I did not acknowledge the attempt. I simply resumed the agenda. Item 1, I said calmly. Capital stabilization plan. We moved forward. Not emotionally, operationally, because companies do not thrive on revenge. They thrive on continuity. Outside of work, I relocated. Not out of fear, out of preference. I purchased a home near the ocean, clean lines, open light, minimal history. I kept no relics from the previous house except a single framed photograph from before ambition became shared strategy. I reduced my public appearances, delegated more, but selectively, traveled less, listened more. The irony was not lost on me. The stress that nearly K** led me was not competition. It was proximity, trust misapplied, silence misread. I began speaking privately to executive groups about governance vulnerability, not about Laura specifically, but about structural blind spots. I told them something simple. Competence is not immunity. The closer the access, the greater the exposure. Most nodded. Some looked uncomfortable. Good. Experience is only valuable if it instructs. Months later, Laura requested a meeting. Not legal, personal. I agreed in a public place. She looked different, less composed. Not broken, just stripped of performance. I never wanted it to escalate, she said. I listened. You were always in control, she continued. I felt secondary. Mark said diversification was protection. Protection from what? I asked. She didn't answer directly. From being irrelevant. There it was. Not greed. Not desperation. Insecurity. That almost cost us everything. You didn't diversify, I said calmly. You attempted extraction. She nodded once. I misjudged you. Yes, I replied. You did. There was no apology exchange. No reconciliation. Just acknowledgement. We parted without hostility. Closure does not require warmth. It requires accuracy. My health stabilized completely within the year. I still work. Not at the pace I once did, but intentionally, measured. And when I sit now at the head of a boardroom table without her, I understand something with clarity I didn't possess before the collapse. The greatest advantage of age is not strength. It is pattern recognition. Laura and Mark believed they were acting during a moment of weakness. They interpreted silence as confusion. They interpreted survival as fragility. They believed preparation equaled superiority. But they forgot one detail. I built everything they attempted to move. Every system, every safeguard, every contingency. They were navigating terrain I designed. And in the end, documentation defeated ambition. Patience defeated acceleration. Exposure defeated concealment. I did not win because I was stronger. I won because I did not react. I recorded. I verified. I moved deliberately. Sometimes the most devastating response is not confrontation. It is allowing the truth to surface fully in public, in record, in consequence. I survived the collapse. I survived the betrayal. More importantly, I survived long enough to watch their calculations collapse under their own weight. And that is something no court can award and no settlement can quantify. Dignity is not loud. It is steady. It does not panic when tested. It waits. Experience is not weakness. It is leverage accumulated quietly over decades. And silence? Silence is often mistaken for surrender. Until the moment it becomes strategy. I am still here, and I remain very deliberate.